Welcome to the Minds and Memoirs podcast.
I'm Jake Maynard, a third-year student at the University of Texas at Austin, studying business with interests in behavioral economics and mental health.
And I'm Jordy Bach, a rising senior at Wash U in St. Louis. I study psychology, neuroscience, philosophy, and computer science, also with an interest in mental health. And in this bonus episode about substance use and mental health, we spend the whole conversation talking with Dr. Lori Holleran-Steiker about the connection between substance use, addiction, and mental health.
She's a professor and an administrator at the University of Texas at Austin, focused on addiction, recovery, and substance use services. Okay, well, welcome, Dr. Holleran-Steiker, to the Minds and Memoirs podcast. We're happy to have you on to discuss, mental health and as it relates to substance use and addiction. So thank you for coming on and speaking with us.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So first of all, tell us about yourself and your expertise in addiction and substance use.
Sure. So my name is Lori Holleran-Steiker, and I'm an Associate Dean and Professor of Addictions, Recovery, and Substance Use Services here at the University of Texas at Austin. I actually started as a clinician, working as a social worker in psychiatric hospitals as my setting. And I think that has powerful relevance for what we're talking about today, because I was hired as an addiction social worker, and because of my lack of seniority was pulled to almost every unit at the psychiatric hospital I was working at. And so the learning experience was profound in terms of seeing how substance use and the different disorders overlapped and how the recoveries sort of intertwined. So I'm excited to talk about that. But I went back for my PhD in order to study particularly substance use and mental health in adolescents and young adults. That has been my primary area of research, everything from prevention to intervention to recovery high schools. And most recently, I am appointed by the governor and the Health and Human Services organization here in Texas to serve on the Opioid Abatement Fund Council. So we'll be making decisions about how to disperse the pharmaceutical settlement monies in order to solve the problem of the opioid epidemic. So I have a wide range of experiences, but I think that it's important for your audience to know that I also am a person with lived experience. So the Minds and Memoirs combo particularly appeals to me because I've given this a lot of thought and a lot of study, but I also have the experience of being a young person who did not have handle on my substance use initially, who got into recovery by the time I was 22. And I just recently celebrated 35 years in recovery with continued emphasis on growth and recovery and mental health. And I also, along the way, was diagnosed as part of my therapeutic settings. And I do believe that therapy and being in therapy makes me a stronger person. And I don't view that as a sign of weakness. I think some of the healthiest and strongest and most successful people I know utilize the help of professionals to navigate the world, because it's a complicated place. But I have to say that my diagnosis was not a full-blown depression. It's something called dysthymia, which is essentially an undercurrent of depression, that if I am doing what I have learned to do in my life in terms of taking care of myself, I'm able to stay above it and function at a level that is beyond my wildest imagination. So I know that's a long introduction, but I wanted to make clear that whatever I share is sort of a braid of personal, professional as a clinician, and research.
Yeah, that's really powerful stuff. And again, you're like the perfect guest for our show because you have the connection between the personal experience and the professional experience. So
Thank you.
yeah, I guess going back to the beginning, how like why and how did you originally begin researching and focusing on substance abuse?
Well, I think that what happened was when I was working as a clinical social worker, I was witnessing how so many of the adolescents we worked with and young people that we worked with were not hooking in to a recovery program. We used to call it the rule of thirds. There were about a third of the young people that I worked with would come in and be desperate and hook into what we were talking about and be very excited about a new way of life and get on board. About a third would do what we called revolving door, where they'd come in and get well for a while and change some behaviors and maybe make some improvements in sort of a harm reduction kind of way, but then would wind up cascading back to previous behaviors. And then about a third of the youth that I was working with, and of course this was the late 90s, and there are more technical awareness and evidence-based practices now than there ever were there then, but about a third of the kids that we were working with were dying of addiction. And I found it terrifying and heartbreaking. I had some survivor guilt because I had a family that my mom got into recovery when I was a little girl, so I sort of had a map for what that looked like and how to navigate it, and many people do not. So I actually went to the Arizona State University and asked them if they could help me find a job to be of most service. And they said, we do indeed have a job for you, but you have to be a doctoral student. So I'm sort of an accidental professor that way. I fortunately wound up with a mentor. I'll name him just in case anybody wants to look him up because I think he's brilliant. His name is Dr. Flavio Marsilia at Arizona State University. He's the director of the Southwestern Interdisciplinary Research Center and did a lot of work around interethnic relationships at the time and was very, very interested in drug prevention. So because I was getting so burned on watching people die of addiction, my initial research was in the area of culturally grounded drug prevention programming, which I think Dr. Marsilia was really a stronghold in recognizing that we couldn't just create these curricula for adolescents in ivory towers. They had to be with the integration of the feedback of the young people themselves. And so I got hooked on prevention research. And when I came to the University of Texas as an assistant professor, I got continued funding to do culturally grounded prevention work. But my interest was not just in school-based prevention, it was community-based prevention, and I have always loved community-based work. I think that there's a lot of power in it. I think that the youth that are at risk most often are not most accessible in the public and charter and private schools. I think they're most accessible in community agencies, sometimes because they're street youth, sometimes because they're incarcerated, sometimes because they're in hospitals and treatment centers. So those are the youth I started working with, and eventually it started pointing me back towards intervention, which is the love of my life. And in about 2012, one of my own kids ran into a problem with drugs and alcohol, and I realized that there wasn't enough in the care continuum to really be a safety net for kids that age. So I actually studied what was going on in Houston. Houston has a stronghold of adolescent services for youth with substance use disorders, both a recovery high school and something called alternative peer groups. So I brought that model back to Austin, and Central Texas decided we ought to start our own recovery high school and tie in the alternative peer groups and to link it up with the University of Texas. So we had all the researchers, all of the students, all of the connections, and the UT Center for Students in Recovery to mentor the youth. So I've always considered myself sort of an innovator. I love listening really carefully to people because times change, drugs change, trends change. So listening to young people and what they had to tell me really made a difference in sort of being the springboard for my research and my work in this area.
Yeah, that's... Oh, okay. Yeah, a lot of interesting things there. Thank you. So tying our discussion, or kind of guiding our discussion towards the connection to mental health, my first question is substance use, can it be considered a mental health problem?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked this question. This is the greatest misconception of any, not just in the public, but among clinicians and professionals as well. People tend to think of it as something totally different. And what we know today, and it's very clear, and it's outlined in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, number 5, very clearly. So the DSM-5, which is what has a layout of all the mental health challenges, all the mental illnesses. Substance use disorder is included as in that manual. It is actually very clearly diagnosed. There are 11 criteria. And the one change that was made from the DSM-4 to the DSM-5 that I found the most advantageous was that we used to diagnose it by saying either you have it or you don't. Either you're dependent or you're not. And the DSM-5 recognizes that there's a continuum of substance use disorders. So there are some people with mild substance use disorders who may be running into some consequences, have a couple of the criteria, but not in a way that is an emergency. Then there's moderate substance use disorders. And then there's what we call addiction, which are the severe substance use disorders. And the interplay between substance use disorders and mental illnesses is not only prevalent, but I would say commonplace. And it is very difficult to tease the two out. If you look at the National Institute of Mental Health, they very clearly state that the very best treatments treat both at the same time. Here's the problem. The problem is that in our field, because resources were given differently to mental health and to substance use, because of that schism, silos have grown. And so there's mental health treatment over here, and there's substance use treatment over here. And the problem with that is once they're siloed, then people are left in the public to figure out, well, where do I belong? Should I be going for mental health care or should I be going for substance use? So ideally, we'll be breaking down those silos, that there'll be what the mental health field has called no wrong door, that if you went into a mental health or a behavioral health agency, that they would be able to diagnose you holistically, figure out what's going on, whether it's mental health or substance use, but better yet, are there aspects of both and where do they overlap? And I say one more thing about that. I know I'm giving a little bit of a long answer to your question.
No, please continue.
Oh, great. I think it's really important for people to understand. A lot of times people are like, well, we got to figure out which is primary. We've got to figure out which came first, which is the main disorder, and that's what we've got to treat. And this is really an erroneous perspective, because the truth is that if you're a person with a mental illness and you're misusing substances to the point of having a mild, moderate, or severe substance use disorder, it's going to be almost impossible to treat your mental illness without concurrently addressing the substance use disorder, whether or not you were doing it to self-medicate or whether it was coexisting because of some brain chemistry or genetic issue. So the cause is what people get caught up in. It's what prompted this. And what we as clinicians know is that it is much more effective to focus on what's going on for this person right here, right now, when we diagnose them, and how can we address holistically all that's going on with them. So this concept of self-medicating is really problematic because I think a lot of people say, well, of course they're misusing substances because they're so depressed or they're so anxious or they have this thought disorder and they're having hallucinations or schizophrenia or whatever maybe it's trauma, PTSD. And so people jump to, well, they've been trying to medicate themselves to address the problem. But there's so many complexities to once somebody starts experimenting with substances, they may have a compulsion to keep using the substances with or without the cause, if that makes sense. So I really encourage our listeners to start thinking in terms of the complexity of mental illness and substance use as one thing instead of two separate arenas that we need to bridge. That's part of my life's work. It's part of my life experience. I really believe that if I thought that I could go to therapy long enough to be able to use substances in a way that was not problematic, I would have done that. And honestly, for what I know about myself, that my brain chemistry I was predisposed for substance use, misuse, and addiction because it runs in my family. And so there's no such thing as moderation for me. So that's a nice fantasy that if I addressed my depression and got well around that, I'd be able to drink like all other drinkers or use like recreational users, but that wouldn't have been my truth, if that makes sense. On the flip side, using substances can also prompt mental illness, especially for adolescents. One of the things we know is if you have a propensity for psychosis, for example, and it is underlying and has never shown up in your mental health presentation, that if you do something as what people consider benign as smoking marijuana, it can actually prompt the psychotic episode earlier in your life than later. And the problem with earlier episodes with either substance use or mental health is that you don't have the well-developed coping mechanisms or the ability to reach out for help or the capacity to have clarity. So there's a lot more risk for crisis if we're not looking at all these issues at once.
Yeah. I know that one of the biggest challenges in like diagnosing mental illnesses and psychological issues is it's so difficult to determine causal factors. And so
absolutely,
and especially when you have, like co-occurring issues like a mental illness alongside a substance use issue, there's so much interplay between the two, as well as genetic factors, environmental factors, personal factors, that looking for causes and saying, oh, we can address this part of it and then this comes next, it just doesn't work. So yeah.
No. And I want to add two thoughts that you've prompted for me, Jordy. One is nowadays with opioids being pervasive on the streets and laced often, sometimes exclusively, with fentanyl in them. So even if somebody is trying to self-medicate, like we have stories of students at UT who were experiencing anxiety, thought, oh, I'll just get a Xanax and get a good night's sleep and I'll be better, bought the Xanax from an unreliable source and did not wake up in the morning. So we're not just talking about people with full-blown substance use disorders that are, disruptions in the pleasure pathway in the brain. Sometimes we're just talking about somebody that is trying to take care of a mental health problem, and because of substances, their life is in danger. The other thought that I had when you were talking about this, other than with opioids, is that I think it's really important to recognize that trauma is a major part of mental health problems and substance use these days. Trauma can mean many different things. It can mean growing up with a parent with health problems or mental health issues. It can be losing a parent early. It can be having an illness yourself. It can be growing up with a low socioeconomic status or some kind of threat in your life. But nowadays, it can even be, I have social phobia and I'm so isolated that I just can't seem to connect with other people. And that depth of loneliness often leads to hopelessness. It can lead to self-loathing. And all of these things are entangled with depression, with anxiety. And a lot of times the thought is, I can make this better with some substances. But it can also lead to suicidality, which are more likely to be able to commit suicide if you're under the influence of a substance. So that's another entanglement. So I'm so grateful that at The Wire, we were able to do this part of the podcast to say, you definitely have to do Minds and Memoirs Part 2 so that you can talk about the next layer of complexity and the areas that we have not figured out in the research field yet. I mean, and not in the research field, not in the ecological systems field, not in the field of resources and insurance and funding these care issues. So I think you guys have your work cut out for you. And so do I.
Were there any other ways that substances interact with mental health issues that you wanted to touch on, or did you cover most of them?
Let's see. I think I touched on a lot of them. I do want to talk a little bit about this concept of the healthcare system.
Okay.
Just to say, I've already pointed out how there's this very dramatic schism between mental health services and substance use services. We're working very hard to bring them together with the term and the arena called behavioral health care. So I think that is definitely an area for us to build on, and I'm very grateful for that. There are mental health administrations in terms of funneling money, and there ought to be behavioral health. But sometimes behavioral health is just a moniker for substance use services. So I think that there are a lot of complexities to how people can get help. I want to add the piece about hope. In my own experience, I think I mentioned already that I had misused substances early enough in my life that you guys have met me for all of a half an hour, and you can tell that I'm a pretty enthusiastic and joyful and sparkly person by nature. And in my active addiction, I was unrecognizable. I was sad, isolating, lonely, terrified, afraid that any minute I'll be found out. I did not feel like I was smart enough or funny enough or acceptable in any way. I had a really warped perception of myself. And I, on certain days, just wished I'm not a person that would have had the gumption to be able to take my life, the courage to do so. I think I assumed I'd screw it up like other things. So that was sort of protective in a way. But I do have to say that the degree of despair was almost indescribable. And by virtue of having people that had gotten well before me, people who wrapped themselves around me even when I did not want to be close with anyone, and people who took a chance on me. I think because I had friends and family that simply would not back off from being my safety net, that I was able to start that road to wellness. The road looks different for lots of people, but I have to say that there are so many people that I know, even who have started recovery at 14, 15, 16, who are devoted to being of service to other people because there were other people that served for them. So I do want to say that, these Minds and Memoirs podcasts can be very scary because sometimes the statistics show us that we're still in some real crisis around these things. But part of the reason that we can't tangibly say the number of people that get well is it's very hard to measure. Some people don't go to treatment at all and they got well by virtue of mutual help support groups. Some people get into treatment for short periods of time and stay in recovery. Some are in and out of treatment. Some are in individual care. Some are in psychiatric hospitals. Some are in addiction treatment. Some are in private care. Some are in nonprofits. So I feel a responsibility to say to the two of you that there are so many solutions that are based in love and compassion and caring that if there's somebody listening to this who says, I'm beyond help, I would say, I dare you. I dare you to reach out to me and get connected, or to anyone in the field who has had a similar struggle, and get connected, because I think there is a pathway to recovery for absolutely everyone if they find the right one. Sometimes it takes additional professional care from therapeutic settings. Sometimes it's medication-assisted therapies. I believe in that, and I have witnessed that working in people's lives. Just like we use medication for mental health recovery, we also use it sometimes for addiction recovery. And so I think that the general public doesn't know that there are so many resources and so many options. And so I would say that if you're really struggling, to reach out to the people that are at recovery community organizations. There are such things as recovery coaches that cost absolutely nothing, and they can get you on the right track.
Absolutely. And I think we should include on the website for Minds and Memoirs just a list of a bunch of resources.
I would love
Dr.
that.
Holleran-Steiker, I'll talk with you and we can get a bunch on there because I think that'd be extremely helpful to people.
Thank you, Jay.
One question I had was, I know you've shared a little bit about your personal experience with mental health, but how a little bit more into depth with that. How has your personal experience been between mental health and substance use? And one question I had was do you feel that one is more responsible for the other? In terms of mental health and substance use, which one is kind of affecting each other the most?
Yes, I really believe that because substance use disorders and addiction and mental health ran in my families, I was sort of a person with mental illness and substance use waiting to happen when I was born. My grandmother had a bipolar disorder. My grandfather had a gambling addiction. My mother had both bipolar disorder and alcohol use disorder. And it goes much further back than that. But I have to say that my experience of being an adolescent, I think all adolescents, I think in high school, I felt insecure about not being cool enough or not fitting in. And I was actually the kind of person that was sort of what do they say? I'm so embarrassed. What's the animal that changes based on what it's up against?
The chameleon?
The chameleon, yes. So I was in the theater crowd and could blend in. I played sports in, high school. I could blend in. I was on the, honor society and, got a role there and could blend in. I play piano and sang, so as part of the performing arts. And in all of these settings, I had amazing potential. But even before I added drugs and alcohol, there was this sensation of being a fake and a phony, and everybody was going to find out, and I was just going to be left alone. And I think that sensation, it's hard to know whether that came from depression and dysthymia oriented brain chemistry or my predisposition for substance misuse. But as soon as I delved into using alcohol and other substances, it served as sort of a fix to those feelings initially. The sensation was, oh, wow, this is what's been missing from my life, because now I feel good enough and I feel smart and I feel funny, and I thought my band sounded better. You know how that is. I mean, that's it. It warps your perceptions. But what happened was, once I added drugs and alcohol in, I was sort of chasing that feeling of feeling okay, because as soon as it would wear off, not only would I not feel okay, but I'd feel worse than when I started using. So the sensation, and this was the depressive part, the sensation was each time that I would come out from using drugs and alcohol, that I would be lower on the rung of how I felt about my life. My view of the world would be darker. My view of myself would be darker. My view of other people was darker. And my view of my belief in good things in the world, just, my spiritual view, the way I made meaning of the whole world, was warped, because I started thinking that everybody was lying and manipulating and BSing the way I was to try to look okay. So it's hard to have faith in other people when you are putting on a mask every single day and acting like somebody that you know that you're not. So it's really hard for me to discern which was primary for me. But I have to say, as soon as I got on, not as soon as, 6 to 18 months into my recovery, the first 6 to 18 months were a bear, because my brain chemistry hadn't adjusted, my coping mechanisms hadn't adjusted, my sense of the world hadn't changed enough, my capacity to really let other people in hadn't changed enough. So at first it was like the hardest thing I'd ever done. But I hung on there because I watched other people who had been through similar struggles, who assured me that if I kept coming and kept showing up and kept not using and kept going to people for help, that it would get better. And I don't even remember when it happened, but I eventually had that moment where it was, some people have a very dramatic spiritual awakening. Oh, angels singing, my life is different. It was very subtle for me. There was just one day where I woke up and it was like, oh my God, I really am looking forward to my day. And that I hadn't felt that before in a lot of years, not since I was a little girl. And so it started coming more frequently. And now I have to tell you, years and years later, part of the reason why I'm able to have this joyous, magnificent life with perspective about what's important and a sense of comfort in my own skin is because I continue to do the things that work in the first place. I make myself of service to other people. I tell my story. I share with close friends and sponsors when I am feeling anxious or afraid or sad, with a depth of sadness. I go to therapy every 2 weeks. I have a brilliant therapist who I hang on her every word. I'm a well-educated therapist myself. She manages to share ideas and evidence-based and research and coping mechanisms and thoughts and resources with me that I don't know about. So I think a lot of it is about being honest and open and willing and teachable. Making myself vulnerable as a human being. Like, you never graduate, right? It's a lifetime of learning. So, but I have to say, I never dreamt that I'd have this magnificent life that I have, and that I would get to be sharing the amount of joy and hope and miracles. I don't know if your audience identifies with the concept of miracles, but that's how it feels to me. It feels miraculous. So thanks.
that is a extremely moving and inspirational story. So thank you for sharing. And it's also very inspirational to hear that from this experience you've, devoted your life to helping others get through it. So yeah, amazing.
Can I say one more thing?
Mm-hmm.
I tend to like these days to dedicate presentations and podcasts and talks and summits and things to the people that have not made it. We have learned a lot from them and their life experiences. I just recently lost a very dear friend to an opioid overdose, a person who had, I think, made more of a difference in the harm reduction field than any other individual that I have ever known. And we are climbing on the shoulders of giants. I do believe that it's important to say people are still dying, and we need support and resources, and we need to continue our dogged, tireless trudging of the road to improving the systems of care for all the individuals in need. So I want to just say that there's a balance of hope, and there's also, partially due to this opioid epidemic, a great deal of tragedy. I think COVID has made that harder too. So I'm going to come out in the middle so that we don't end on a really heartbreaking note. And I'm going to say that this is a call to action, that there's a lot of work to do for the joy of those that are able to get into recovery, and for those that we have lost. I think that we honor everyone by continuing to have conversations like this. So I'm deeply grateful that you made this opportunity possible, and that this conversation will continue, hopefully, among young people who will be around way longer than I will. So I'm really excited about that piece. Thanks.
Absolutely. And Jordy, do you want to ask that next question?
Yeah, so I guess this is a nice segue because you ended up talking about young people. Why is it you think that the youth and the younger generations seem to be the most vulnerable to substance use disorders?
It's a great question. We have learned a ton about the brain chemistry of childhood and adolescence over the past few years. Like when I taught my young people in drugs class back in the early 2000s, we had so much less information about what is happening in the brain that makes young people vulnerable for mental health problems and substance use disorders. And thanks to neuroscientists and biological scientists and brain scientists, some of my colleagues that work in the labs with their adolescents, who are actually mice and rats, we have learned a ton about neural pathways and where in the brain this pleasure pathway occurs, where it gets disrupted. But I think the most potent piece is that we used to think that the brain developed by the age of about 18. They are coming to be potently aware that the brain's neuroplasticity continues up until about the age of 25, sometimes later. So what we know is when substances are introduced while people are developing these neural pathways, that it makes a powerful impact on behavior, on the way that people think, on their capacity to have a future orientation, their ability to have that frontal cortex fully developed in terms of executive functioning and decision making. So I think that that's probably the best answer right now, which is, I saw it once illustrated. It said, Imagine for just a moment that you have parents who have conflict. A lot of kids grow up with parents that fight. And you're in discomfort, laying in your bed, listening to your parents fighting. And all of a sudden it strikes you, wow, I had a cough last week. And when my mom gave me that cough medicine, I got a really good night's sleep. I got a really good night's sleep. So you tiptoe downstairs while they're fighting in their bedroom, and you take out a spoon, and then you maybe look at the spoon and you're like, nah, I'll just take a swig, because if one is good, two is better, because you're a kid and that's how you think, right? If one donut's good, two is better. So you drink a little bit of this cough syrup, you go up to your bed and literally fall asleep right away with no worries about your parents fighting. And you wake up in the morning having had a good night's sleep. Well, guess what that does? That cuts a neural pathway that says, when I'm uncomfortable and something horrible's happening, and I add in this substance, I feel better. And so what do you do the next time your parents are fighting or you're uncomfortable? What comes to mind? Oh, I could use that substance. I feel better when I do it. So you go and you cut that neural pathway even deeper. And every time you do it, it's as if, this is a Bob Meehan quote from his book that he wrote for parents of kids with addiction many years ago called Beyond the Yellow Brick Road. So imagine that there's a stream, okay? And it's traveling, the water's rushing down the stream. Suddenly you take this boulder and you slam it into the stream. And what happens is the water starts going around the boulder, right? Starts cutting a new pathway. Oh, this is how it travels now. This is how it travels now. Even if it travels that way long enough, even if you remove the boulder, what happens is the neural pathway, the pathway of the stream continues to go around where the boulder was because it's cut so deeply. That's like the neural pathways in the brain. If a young person associates feeling better or coping with a substance, then they don't bother with all the coping mechanisms, the healthy coping mechanisms that don't have as much, dare I say, potency. I don't know, I've said that word a lot, but like listening to music can make you feel better. Talking to a friend, going for a walk, swimming in the pool can make you feel better. Eating a nice meal can make you feel better. But sometimes those things don't happen as dramatically as a substance might in terms of the amount of dopamine it releases, right? So what we're talking about here is, I think young people are most at risk and most vulnerable while their brains are still developing. And when they discover drugs or substances or alcohol at a really young age, it can actually interrupt their growth and development, their social development, their psychological development, their interpersonal development, their spiritual development, in very deep and dark ways. And it's very hard for a young adult or an adult to start to reprogram their brain when it's been cut so deeply in their childhood or adolescence. So that would be my answer. I hope that satisfies your question.
Right. I have a quick question follow up to that. So that would include young people up to even in their early, like late teens, or 19, 20, 21, it's like early 20s, kids in college, yes. Like that includes them, even people. So it's like they're changing their coping mechanisms in ways that are using substances, and then that's still creating that neural pathway in a
yes. way. I think that they're at less risk if the behavior starts in college, if they've already established some coping mechanisms. For example, I actually paid my son. I said to him, I'll give you $1,000 if you can get to the age of 17 without using drugs or alcohol. And the reason that I did that was partially, $1,000 sounds like a lot of money to a 17-year-old, but it's a pretty good deal compared to what rehab and psychiatric treatment costs these days. So I thought it was a bargain for me. But honestly, it helped him because it gave him an excuse to tell other people why he wasn't using. Oh, I lose $1,000 if I come home high. My mom drug tests me and breathalyzes me, which I think that's a pretty dramatic thing. But if you're an addictions counselor, you can get away with it with your kids. But the other thing that I wanted to say about that was the reason that I found it valuable was he learned that shooting baskets made him feel better. Playing guitar made him feel better. Hanging out with friends, maybe gaming a little bit. That might have been overboard to a certain degree. That can be an addictive behavior too. But when he did experiment with substances in college and it became somewhat problematic for him, he had awareness about it and knew that he needed to get some help right away. He had the communication skills and the social skills to be able to say, I could use some help with this, and to get those needs met, and really wound up without a substance use disorder because he had those early developed coping mechanisms. So yeah, people who start in college have a much better chance. One, because they've developed some coping mechanisms early, but because they may be able to have the coping to be able to reach out for help. That being said, it's still risky for young people who are 19, 20, 21, even 22, to be using substances that change the way that their brain works.
Okay, gotcha. So I guess on a broader note, would you say, could it be fair to say that, youth should consider, if they do use substances, they should consider it through the lens of a mental health perspective, because it's kind of like there's some underlying coping mechanism at play typically? Is that
interesting? It's an interesting frame. I think that there's everything along the spectrum. There are going to be some young people who say, I'm comfortable in my skin. I know how to have fun without it. It's not worth the risk to me, or it runs in my family, or I've seen my cousins or my aunts and my uncles look stupid. I'm just not interested in that, or I'm more focused on my career and there's things I love, or sports or whatever. So there's some people that have just no interest in it at all.
Right,
There'll be others that literally can use without consequences, who can drink on a Friday night, know when to stop, not have any problem, know that they would never get behind the wheel when they do it, know that they would not want to get to the point where they were out of control. So there are some people that really don't have the makings of a substance use disorder. There are other people who, because of the crowd they hang out with and what they're attracted to, what they think is cool, there are some people you literally, as a young person, can drink or use substances enough to actually change your brain chemistry and disrupt your pleasure pathway such that it'll be almost the equivalent of being genetically predisposed, where once you cross that invisible line, you can't go back to moderate use. So I think that's the other risk that young people should be aware of. You can use yourself into addiction. You absolutely can.
Okay.
Yeah, that's an important point. Thanks for asking that.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's a whole spectrum of options and people who fit within that.
That's right. And I would say if you are a person that uses substances, to really pay attention to being mindful and to have intentions to use safely. Now, I'm not promoting use. My life looks better without it, and a lot of people's life looks better without it. But if you're choosing to use, you should know about, fentanyl test strips. You should be with people you trust. You should never, ever be in a vehicle with somebody that's under the influence, or you yourself drive under the influence. You should know that things can get out of control and have friends that would be honest with you if they saw that happening. So I really think connectedness is one of the biggest solutions for mental health problems, for substance use and misuse and addiction. We really want to make sure that you're surrounded by people that you trust, that you're connected with good friends and family. And if you don't have those connections, to get connected through mental health resources, recovery coaches, therapists, groups. It can be through social groups in college too. So I'd say get connected with people you trust. That's probably the most protective mechanism in college.
Definitely, yes. And I'll make sure to add some resources to the website so people can check that out at mindsandmemoirs.com. But thank you again, Dr. Holleran-Steiker, for sharing your expertise, your insights, and personal stories with us. We really deeply appreciate your experience, and we believe that understanding the interaction between substance use and mental health matters a lot, so especially with the youth. So thank you so much. We really enjoyed having you on the podcast.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you both so much.
Thank you for listening to this Minds and Memoirs bonus episode featuring Dr. Lori Holleran-Steiker.
Check out mindsandmemoirs.com for more information about the podcast and for a collection of mental health and substance use resources.